Have you ever stood at the edge of a garden just as the day was giving itself over to night? That in-between hour when the air cools and the sky holds its breath as if it knows a secret it's about to tell you? Out beyond the last row of flowers, there's a small wooden gate. Its paint has faded to the color of soft wheat, and its hinges carry the quiet memory of years gone by. If you lean close, you can still smell the sun on the wood, mixed with the faintest trace of rosemary drifting from the herb bed. No one hurries at this hour. The crickets begin their patient music, the wind stirs just enough to turn the leaves, and the light itself seems to linger a little longer than it should. You might think it's just a gate, but those who know it understand. It's a doorway to a place where the heart remembers how to rest. Tonight we'll walk there together, slowly, letting the day fade behind us and stepping into a quiet evening that will hold you until sleep finds you. Take a slow breath in as if you're drawing the last warm light of the day into your chest. Hold it gently, not tight, just enough to feel its kindness. Now let it go long and unhurried, the way fields let go of heat when the evening settles in. Again, inhale and let your shoulders fall a little. Exhale and let your jaw loosen. If you like, place a hand over your belly and feel the rise and fall, like a small boat on a quiet creek, rocking itself toward rest. This first hour is for settling. Let the small concerns of the day take a step back and sit down somewhere comfortable. They're not gone, they're simply resting, the way tools rest in a tidy shed after honest work. Picture a modest farmhouse with paint the color of cream that has seen sun and rain and still holds together with dignity. A wide porch faces a garden that has learned your name. At the far end of that garden stands a simple wooden gate, 3 horizontal slats, a faithful latch, a hinge that sings only when it needs to, never more. Clover gathers like a soft congregation near its posts. Beyond the fence, a field listens for night. The air has changed. It has traded afternoon's bright insistence for evening's low kindness. The breeze carries a coolness from the creek, and with it the smell of water over stones. Tomato vines keep their green, sun-warmed scent. Basil lifts a peppery sigh. Rosemary remembers the heat and gives back a little of it as the light thins. Somewhere at the porch's edge, a wind chime considers a note and lets it go as if to say, "I'm here." Elias sits on the porch step with his hands resting open, the posture of a man who understands there is nothing to hold too tightly. His boots are beside him, a day's dust laid gently across the leather like pale pollen. He does not hurry to rise. There is a way the land settles itself at dusk, a way the maples offer their leaves to the last of the light, a way the chickens find their simple arguments resolved by roosting, and he has come to trust it. There are things a man earns by waiting. The quiet is one of them. He watches the garden. The path through the grass is clean and unimportant, which is to say it is exactly as a good path should be. A row of zinnias holds color without complaint. The trellis at the cucumbers makes a patient geometry against the sky. The herb bed, low and sturdy, keeps its small seasons in the palm of a single hour. In that slowness, even the smallest sounds have room to live. The chalking of crickets starting their first notes, a single wren making a last brief remark, the porch boards easing with the shift from warm to cool. Breathe again, a little softer this time. You are among gentle things. He reaches down and touches the step beside him. All day, the wood collected sunlight. Now the board releases warmth in small offerings, enough to comfort the palm, enough to say, "You arrived in time." He smiles not because he planned to, but because another part of him did. The cat, old, well-fed, the color of toast, emerges from the rhubarb, considering the boundary between yard and home, and then decides to be a bridge between them. It curls around Elias's ankle, purring like a small, dependable machine, and sits as if to honor the hour that asks so little and gives so much. The house has its evening voice. Pipes relax somewhere within the walls. The kitchen breathes a faint sweetness, bread crumbs and a memory of coffee cooled on the counter. A chair waits with its back at a friendly angle. The clock in the front room ticks in a manner that reassures rather than insists, turning minutes into something like a lullaby. No one is in a hurry here, not even time. When Elias finally stands, he does it the way he does most things, deliberately, with a respect for hinges, for knees, for the quiet economy of a body that has known both work and the rest that keeps work honest. He doesn't put on the boots. He leaves them at the step and he goes barefoot, letting his feet remember what the ground feels like when it's neither hot nor cold, but newly simple. The grass is cool and a little damp. Each blade leans and returns, forgiving and faithful. He walks the path toward the gate, not because anything important waits there, but because the not important things often carry the most truth. On his left, the tomato cages keep their neat circular promises. On his right, the zinnias attend to color with the seriousness that requires no explanation. He passes the low fence that keeps the rabbits honest and the lettuce generous. A firefly considers the evening and approves of it, then another, then a few more. None of them announce themselves. They arrive the way sleep arrives when it is welcomed, without argument, with a logic so kind you hardly notices it until you're held. He pauses by the herb bed and pinches a leaf of thyme, bringing it to his nose. The scent is small and exact, as if the plant had written a letter to the evening saying only what needed to be said. He rubs his fingers together and sets them near the cat. The cat inspects, finds the offering acceptable, and blinks in agreement. They continue, a pair of creatures shaped by the same gentle laws. Step, breathe, listen. Step, breathe, listen. At the gate, Elias places both palms on the top slat. The wood is smooth where hands have taught it to be. He knows every knot and nail head by feel, knows where a winter once tried to split the board and a careful spring mended it. The latch is cool now. He lifts it and lets it fall again, not to open, just to hear the soft, faithful syllable it makes. Some sounds are whole enough to live in. This is one of them. And here, if you like, you can rest too. You can lean your attention against this gate and let it carry a little of your weight. The day can be heavy. The evening does not mind. It is strong in the ways that matter. It holds the field on one side and the tended garden on the other, and it knows both are needed. Elias looks past the fence. The field beyond is a single deepening color, like cloth being dipped, shade by shade. The creek is mostly a suggestion at this distance, but its voice carries a low, continuous kindness over rocks that do not argue back. A hawk's shape crosses the last pale of the sky, already on its way to a quiet branch somewhere upriver. Somewhere down the road, a truck passes, respectful and soon gone, leaving the world as it found it. He remembers, without chasing the memory, that once he stood at this gate as a boy. A larger hand guided his smaller one toward the latch. Easy, the hand had said, not a command, more a way of naming the truth. Easy was not about laziness. It was about the right shape of effort. Lift only what is yours to lift. trusts the hinge to carry the door. Close what you open. He does not think long about it. He lets the remembering pass through him the way the breeze does, stirring and settling, nothing more than what it is. Another breath now. In through the nose, out through the mouth. A little slower, if that's kind to you. From here, the house shines a square of lamplight onto the lawn. It is not bright, just enough to be a promise. The window glass holds the soft gold, and the gold holds the evening like a cup. Elias listens for the kettle. He thinks it will speak soon, a gentle murmur. Yes, there it is, like a cloud releasing a little of itself against cool glass. The sound makes space for the next quiet. The wind chimes small conversation, the steady bow of the crickets, the porch giving one last creak as it settles its own thinking for the night. He does not need to decide anything. That is one of the gifts of this hour. The world is already turning toward rest, and he may turn with it. He touches the latch once more, and this time he opens the gate just enough to step through, and then closes it again. The way you close a good book, not because you are finished with it, but because you will return. The cat slips ahead and then waits, tail bending like a question mark answered by its own contentment. Elias follows, the grass blessing his ankles, the thyme remembering his touch, the rosemary letting go of one more breath of heat. The path is the same as it was yesterday, and that sameness is not a prison. It is a kindness, a way the land says, you are held. At the steps he pauses and looks back. The gate stands in the deepening blue, not a guard, not a wall, just a witness. He nods to it for no reason other than gratitude is its own reason. He puts a hand to the door frame and feels the paint cool to the touch, the grain of the wood still speaking through it. The house breathes again, and the room inside waits the way a friend waits, quietly, with room for whatever you bring. If you are listening from some distance of your own, another town, another year, let the garden hold you as it holds him. Let the evening be enough. Let the hinge speak a word. The day could not find and accept it without translation. There is a bed somewhere with linen that will feel like water at first and then like a shore. There is a lamp that will be turned low. There is a window and beyond it a gate that will keep its modest watch. Come inside now, not to shut the world out, but to let it rest outside as it is. The kettle is ready, the chair is kind, and the story, like the path through the grass, will be here when you return to it, moving at the pace of a human heart that has remembered how to go gently. The next evening, Elias rose from his chair at much the same hour as before. The air, though shaped by the same August warmth, had its own small character tonight. A faint thread of coolness drawn from the shaded places along the creek, a slightly different timbre in the wind, as if the trees had been thinking all day and were now ready to speak in quieter tones. He had not meant to make a ritual of this, walking from porch to gate, but the body remembers what is kind to it, and so, almost without decision, he found himself standing on the porch boards, bare feet resting against the grain, the old screen door settling shut behind him. The cat was already in the yard, as if it knew his mind before he did, tail lifted in a casual question. The grass between porch and garden had grown by some imperceptible fraction since yesterday. Elias noticed it not with a gardener's disapproval, but with the appreciation of someone who understands that growth has its own clock. Each step bent the blades just enough for dew to darken his skin. The scent rose with his movement, green, clean, threaded with the earthy note of soil, still warm beneath the surface. He passed the zinnias again. their heads turned slightly from where they had been the night before. It wasn't only the light that changed them, it was the unseen work of roots and stems, quietly rearranging themselves toward the better angle, the deeper drink. In that, he thought, they were not so different from people. The tomato vines, heavy with fruit, leaned more against their cages. Elias reached out and cupped one of the ripest tomatoes in his hand. Its skin was warm, smooth, and faintly taut, with the promise of flavor. He didn't pick it. There was a pleasure in knowing it would be there tomorrow, deepening in color, becoming more itself. Some things deserve their full measure of time before they are taken. He paused beside the cucumber trellis, tracing the twist of a tendril around the wire. The plant had found its way upward without instruction, gripping as though it trusted the ladder it had been given. The pattern was both intricate and utterly simple, a slow clasping one curl after another until the sky was reached. The cat, growing impatient with his study of vegetables, wove ahead toward the herb bed. Elias followed, stooping to brush his fingers across the thyme, the rosemary, the sage. Each offered a different memory and scent. Thyme as the warmth of roasted lamb on winter nights, rosemary as the clear, resinous air of high summer, sage as the cool, grounding presence in autumn kitchens. These were not just plants, they were the quiet record keepers of his seasons, holding in their leaves the echoes of meals shared, of hands busy in the kitchens, of chairs drawn closer to the table. Beyond the herbs lay the narrower strip of lawn that led to the gate. The cat stopped there, sitting squarely in the path as though to remind Elias that this part of the walk mattered most. From here, he could see the gate clearly, its top slat catching the last edge of the sun, the lower board shadowed in the beginning blue of dusk. When he reached it, Elias laid his hand on the wood. It felt cooler tonight, the day's warmth retreating faster under the gentler sun. He traced the shallow grooves where years of weather had written their own story into the grain. No two boards were alike, yet together they held the line, not against intrusion, but for the simple keeping of place. He lifted the latch, its metal voice softer in the evening air, and stepped through. The cat followed, brushing against his leg as if to approve the decision. Outside the garden, the field lay in its patient sprawl. The grasses swayed in long, slow arcs, answering the wind in movements older than any fence line. Elias stood for a moment just to watch. There was no need to go farther tonight. The field did not ask for company. It offered itself without condition, the way a friend will leave a chair open at the table, whether or not you come to sit. A hawk circled far off, its shape briefly crossing the blush of the sky. Down near the creek, the air thickened with the scent of water, a mingling of stone, leaf, and the faint sweetness of mud disturbed by small feet or paws. He could hear the steady note of crickets from somewhere deep in the grass, the sound holding its pitch as if it had been practicing all day for this one sustained song. The light shifted. What had been gold turned to a soft rose, then to the muted violet that signaled the slow hand of evening drawing its brush across the horizon. In that light, the gate behind him looked almost like a painting, still and complete, yet never truly finished. Elias turned back after a while, letting the latch fall into place with its modest click. He took his time returning through the garden. Passing the tomatoes again, he thought of how tomorrow's sun would warm them. Passing the zinnias, he imagined the slow turning of their faces in sleep. He stepped over the low fence, careful not to disturb the lettuce leaves that lay folded for the night. By the time he reached the porch, the cat had already claimed the top step, paws tucked neatly beneath its chest, eyes half closed in the way of creatures who trust their surroundings completely. Elias stood a moment longer on the grass, breathing in the cool that had deepened since his first step outside. Inside, the lamp would be lit, the chair waiting, the kettle nearly ready. But here, just here, was the edge of the day's last breath. He let it pass through him slowly, carrying with it the mild fatigue of honest hours, the quiet satisfaction of nothing urgent left undone, and the steadying sense that the garden, the gate, the field, and the man himself were all part of the same patient turning toward rest. Only then did he step up onto the porch, the boards answering with a low creak, and open the door to the soft light and familiar warmth of home. By the third evening, Elias found himself noticing the way his own footsteps had begun to know the route without him. There was a particular turn his body took when he stepped off the porch, one that matched the width of the grass path, and a certain easing of his shoulders once his soles met the coolness of the lawn. It was as though the path itself had trained him over years, gently shaping his walk until it belonged to both of them. The air tonight carried more of the creek's voice, the current running a little stronger from recent rains upstream. That sound, low and constant, folded itself under the chorus of crickets, giving the evening a deeper register, like a bass note in a song that had always been there, even when he wasn't listening. Above it, the leaves of the maples shivered in a mild wind, turning their pale undersides toward the last of the light. Elias didn't begin his walk right away. He stood on the porch for a time, hands in his pockets, simply looking. There is a way light behaves in late summer that belongs only to late summer. It falls more slowly, and yet each degree of fading feels like a reminder that the year has already begun its quiet turning toward fall. You can almost smell that truth in the air, the faint dryness in the grass, the sweetness of ripening fruit, the almost imperceptible thinning of the afternoon's warmth. When he finally stepped down, the cat was nowhere to be seen, and Elias figured it would join him eventually. It often did, appearing from the bean rows, or from the hollow beneath the lilac bushes as though it had been conducting its own small inspection of the place. For now, he was alone, and the path stretched before him in the easy curve he had known since boyhood. Halfway to the garden, his foot brushed against a sprig of mint that had taken root just outside the herb bed. Its scent lifted into the air instantly, sharp, clean, almost startling in its freshness. He crouched down to rub a leaf between his fingers, the green oils lingering on his skin. The plant had likely seeded itself here without anyone's help, making a small life in the shade of the beans. He left it untouched, pleased by its stubbornness. The tomato vines had deepened in color since last night, their fruit shading toward the rich red that signals readiness. He touched one gently, feeling the faint give of the flesh beneath the skin. Not today, he thought. Let the sun finish what it started. The cucumbers hung like lanterns in the dimming light, their skin cool to the touch. A tendril had found its way to the wooden post of the trellis, wrapping itself in perfect spirals. Elias lingered on the symmetry, thinking of how nature never hurried to make such patterns, and yet never seemed late in delivering them. Past the vegetables, the zinnias stood in quiet ranks, their petals layered like the skirts of dancers caught mid-spin. Bees moved among them lazily, their work nearly done for the day. One bee, dusted gold, with pollen, clung to a bloom longer than necessary, as if reluctant to give up its hold on the light. Elias understood. Evening has that effect. It asks you to pause before you cross fully into the next thing. Beyond the flowers, he could see the gate, dimmer now in the cooling air. The wood surface caught the faintest blush from the horizon, the color of embers in a fire that will last the night. When he reached it, his palm found the same smooth grain, the same shallow ridges worn in by years of contact. He rested both hands there for a moment before lifting the latch. The field beyond was familiar, but tonight it carried a particular scent. Fresh cut hay from a neighboring farm. It drifted over the fence in slow waves, mingling with the cooler smell of the creek and the earthy breath of the grass underfoot. Somewhere far off, a single cow lowed, its voice deep and unhurried, and then the sound folded itself back into the wide silence. He stayed at the gate longer than usual. Perhaps it was the air, perhaps the hay scent, or perhaps the way the field looked under this exact light. Shadows long and soft, the tops of the grasses lit like the edges of an old quilt, and as he stood there, memory began to work its way in, uninvited but not unwelcome. He was 10 again, barefoot on the very same path, a fishing pole in one hand and a tin of worms in the other. His father walked beside him, neither speaking much, because there was no need. The creek had been higher that summer, swollen by frequent rains, and the fish were plentiful. He remembered the sound of the worms shifting faintly in the tin, the way the metal felt cool against his palm. He remembered his father's stride, longer than his own, and how he had to take 2 steps for every one of the older man's. And most of all, he remembered the unspoken lesson of those walks, that the journey to the gate was as much a part of the fishing as the creek itself. The memory faded as quietly as it had come, leaving him once again in the present dusk. He closed the latch gently as if to honor the boy who had once passed through here. Turning back toward the garden, he noticed the first fireflies of the evening. They winked into existence one by one, not in any hurry to fill the air, but certain that they would. The cat reappeared then, padding along the path as though it had been following him all along from some invisible distance. It brushed against his leg, tail curling in a question that needed no answer, and together they walked back through the garden. The porch light had come on, casting a small, steady circle onto the grass. Elias climbed the steps slowly, the boards greeting him with the same creak they offered every night. He paused at the door to look once more at the gate, now only a shape against the deepening sky. In that moment, it seemed less a barrier and more a guardian of the garden, of the field, of the rhythm that kept both in balance. Inside, the warmth waited for him, but outside, the garden would keep its own quiet watch until morning. And so, with the cat slipping in ahead of him, Elias closed the door softly behind them, carrying the calm of the evening into the rooms where night would finish its work. By the 4th evening, the air had changed again. The day had been warm, but not in the steady, settled way of late summer. A restless wind had moved through since morning, carrying with it the cool scent of the creek and the dry rustle of leaves from farther up the road. It was the sort of wind that would tip a bucket if left out, that would nudge the laundry on the line until each shirt and sheet leaned away like a tired traveler searching for shade. Elias noticed it first thing after breakfast, when the porch swing kept moving on its own, creaking forward and back in small, unplanned arcs. By mid-afternoon, the garden itself had begun to speak in the language of the wind, the zinnias bowing just slightly, the taller bean poles trembling, the rosemary shaking loose a few of its older needles. And by the time the sun leaned toward its lowering, He knew the walk to the gate would be different tonight. The cat was already waiting when he stepped onto the porch, its fur brushed slightly out of order, as if it too had been in conversation with the wind all day. Elias left the boots where they were, bare feet grateful for the firmness of the boards and the way they still held a thin remnant of the sun's heat. The screen door closed behind him with its soft clap, a sound the wind immediately tried to claim, carrying it out toward the field. The first step into the grass was cooler than he expected. The blades leaned away from his toes, bending in the direction of the wind's travel. The air moved against his face in long, even strokes, as though the evening were reaching out to greet him. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the breeze lift the hair at his temples and carry the warmth of the day out of his skin. He passed the zinnias slowly. Tonight their colors seemed deeper, reds like the skin of ripe cherries, oranges that hinted at the first turn of autumn leaves. The wind moved through them in waves, a ripple of bending stems and nodding heads. Bees clung tighter than usual, riding out the sway. One or two lifted into the air reluctantly, circled back and settled again, as if knowing the last nectar of the day was worth holding on for. At the tomato vines, Elias rested his palm against a cage, feeling the faint vibration of the wind in the wire. The fruit hung steady despite the movement around it, each one catching the soft light and turning it into a glow from within. A single loose leaf, torn from somewhere up the path, had found its way into the vines and was now tangled gently among them. He didn't remove it. The garden had a way of arranging itself, even in these small matters. The cucumbers seemed unbothered, their broad leaves flapping like the pages of a half-read book. A tendril had reached farther since yesterday, curling into the empty air, searching for something to hold. Elias thought of how a plant could do that, grow in hope of finding a place to rest its weight, and how often people did the same. Past the vegetables, the herb bed was alive with scent. The wind lifted the sharper notes of mint, the resin of rosemary, the mellow warmth of thyme. It was almost too much at once, yet the air seemed to know how to braid the fragrances together so they became a single ribbon of memory. Roasted meats on winter nights, fresh bread cooling on a summer table, a pot of soup steaming in the kitchen while rain tapped the windows. As he neared the gate, Elias could see it moving slightly on its hinges, the latch lifting a fraction and falling back with each stronger gust. The wood gave a quiet sigh as it swayed, a sound that reminded him of floorboards settling under the weight of someone you loved, moving from one room to another. He placed both hands on the top slat, steadying it, feeling the wind press against the broad side. The wood was cool under his palms. He leaned there for a moment, letting the gate take part of his weight while the wind wrapped itself around him. From here, the field beyond looked almost restless, the grasses bending low, then rising, then bending again in slow unison. And here, in the shifting air, a memory came, as they often did in such places. He was small again, perhaps 7 or 8, standing in the yard on a windy day much like this one. His mother was at the clothesline, her hair pinned up loosely, sleeves rolled to the elbows. She moved between basket and line with a rhythm that matched the snapping of the sheets in the wind. Each clothespin clicked into place with the small certainty of a well-learned task. Elias remembered holding onto the edge of a flapping sheet, feeling it billow and pull against his hands like a living thing. His mother had smiled at him through the linen, her face pale in the sunlight, and said, That's the wind telling us it's not quite done with summer. He hadn't understood then, but he carried the phrase forward, and now, years later, he could feel exactly what she meant. The wind eased for a moment as if to give him space to breathe in the scent of the field. Cut hay, damp earth, the faint sweetness of clover heads brushed open by passing air. Somewhere along the creek, water moved against stone in a shifting pattern, its voice clearer in the spaces between gusts. Elias closed the latch gently and turned back toward the garden. The cat, who had been sitting just inside the fence, rose to follow him, tail flicking once in approval. They walked together through the herbs and vegetables, each step bringing him closer to the soft light spilling from the porch. By the time he reached the steps, the swing was still moving faintly from the wind, its chain giving a small hum. He paused there, hand on the railing, watching the gate from a distance. In the dimming light, it no longer seemed to sway. It had settled back into its quiet watch. He nodded once, as if to acknowledge its work, and stepped inside. The door closed behind him with the wind pressing lightly against it, a final touch before night took over. Inside, the kettle was nearly ready, and the chair by the window waited, offering a view of the gate that would now keep its place until tomorrow's walk. The fifth evening came wrapped in a light so golden it seemed to have been poured, not simply cast. The sky had been clear all afternoon, and now the sun was settling low enough that every leaf, every fence post, every curve of soil in the garden carried its share of that radiance. It was the kind of light that slows a man without him noticing, that makes him linger over small things, a glint on a dewdrop, the way a shadow grows longer than its source. Elias sat for a time on the porch steps, letting the glow rest against his face. The boards beneath him had soaked in the day's warmth, and their steady heat reached through his clothes like the comfort of a hand on his shoulder. The cat was curled in a patch of sunlight on the top step, tail tucked around its paws, eyes half closed in approval of the hour. There was no wind tonight, only a stillness that held the garden as if in a quiet embrace. Even the swing hung perfectly still, its chains untroubled, its seat catching a rectangle of light that matched the last opening in the clouds. When Elias stepped down into the grass, it pressed cool against his bare feet. The air was touched with the sweetness of ripening fruit, the pears on the side of the house giving up their green bite for the soft blush of readiness. Somewhere at the far edge of the field, a bird gave a low, drawn-out call, answered faintly from beyond the creek. He moved slowly along the familiar path, pausing first at the zinnias. Their colors seemed to drink in the light, reds deepening toward wine, oranges rich as a harvest table, yellows mellow and full. Bees worked the blooms with the unhurried certainty of creatures who knew exactly how much daylight remained. Elias leaned closer to one flower and saw a bee so covered in pollen it seemed dusted with gold leaf. The bee paused its work for a moment, as if aware of the company, then bent again to its task. The tomato vines were heavy now, bowing toward the cages that kept them upright. Elias cupped one in his hand, feeling the warm skin stretch slightly over the flesh beneath. Its scent rose as he brushed the small green crown at its top, a smell that was neither wholly fruit nor leaf, but the union of both, carrying with it the heat of sun and the patience of soil. He moved past the cucumbers, their broad leaves lying still in the evening air, and paused at the herb bed. Here, the light seemed to settle deeper, slipping between rosemary stems, glancing off the soft silver of sage leaves, catching in the low blossoms of thyme. He reached for a sprig of rosemary and pinched it gently, letting its clean, resinous fragrance rise and linger. The gate ahead was aglow in the last rays, its top slat warm enough to hold a day's worth of sun in its grain. Elias laid his hand there as he reached it, the wood smooth from years of touch. He didn't lift the latch right away. Instead, he stood still, letting the light settle over both him and the gate, the way dusk often settles over a place it has known for a long time. Beyond the fence, the field was awash in gold. Every blade of grass caught the light along its edge, so the whole expanse seemed rimmed in fire, though it was a gentle, cool fire, meant only to bless and not consume. The creek's surface reflected the sky, turning its small ripples into ribbons of copper and pale rose. As he looked, a memory began to surface, not quickly, but in the slow, unrolling way that memories often come when the body is at rest. It was another evening, many years ago. Elias was a boy of 12, and the air then had smelled of dry leaves and the first fires in distant hearths. His mother had sent him to the garden for a bundle of sage, and as he walked back toward the house, the light caught her in the doorway. She was standing with her hands on her hips, a dishcloth draped over one shoulder, and the setting sun behind her turned her hair to copper. He had paused, caught by the sight, the same way one might pause before a painting, not to admire in a distant way, but to recognize that something in it would live in you forever. She had smiled at him then, the kind of smile that was less about joy and more about seeing someone clearly. "Come in before it's dark," she had said, and he had, carrying both the sage and the unspoken warmth of that moment. The memory faded, but the feeling of it lingered, woven into the golden hour around him. Elias lifted the latch now and stepped through the gate, the cat slipping between his legs as though the opening had been made for it alone. They didn't walk far into the field. It was enough to stand just past the fence and watch the light work its way across the land. Somewhere nearby, a grasshopper leapt and landed, its small sound like a fingertip on a drum. The grasses around them leaned only slightly in the faintest evening air. The light began to thin, not with haste, but with the quiet certainty that its work for the day was done. Shadows grew longer, edges softened, colors deepened. Elias closed the latch gently and turned back toward the garden. Walking through the herbs again, he let his hand drift along the tops of the plants, brushing each one lightly as though greeting old friends on the way home. The tomato vines brushed against his legs. The zinnias nodded once more, their faces turned now toward the last hint of brightness. By the time he reached the porch, the golden light had given way to a soft, even blue. The cat jumped to the top step, waiting for him to follow. Elias paused before opening the door, looking back toward the gate, now a darker shape against the dimming field. It would stand there through the night, as it always had, marking the edge of the garden, holding the quiet between one day and the next. And tomorrow, the walk would be waiting again, under whatever light the evening chose to offer. The sixth evening arrived washed and renewed. A light rain had passed through in the early afternoon, not the kind that hurries the sky into darkness, but the slow, wandering sort that lingers just long enough to leave the world softer than it found it. The air now carried a damp sweetness, earth and leaves and that faint mineral note that comes when water has rested a while in the hollows of stone. From his chair by the window, Elias had watched the last drops fall from the eaves, striking the wet boards of the porch with small, deliberate sounds. He'd seen the garden bow under the weight of water, then lift again as if shrugging off the rain's gentle insistence. And now, with the clouds retreating into the distance, the light was finding its way back, pooling in the low places, slipping along the wet rails of the fence, glinting in every drop still clinging to leaf or petal. When he stepped outside, the boards were cool under his bare feet. The air pressed close, still holding the mildness of summer, but with an added weight that made each breath feel full. The cat sat on the top step, fur darkened in places where it had braved the rain, tail wrapped tight around its body. It glanced at Elias as if to say, "Well, are we going?" The grass gave beneath his feet, heavy with moisture. Each step released a faint scent, green, sharp, and alive. The blades were beaded with droplets that bent the evening light into 1,000 small prisms, each one briefly a rainbow before sliding away into the earth. The zinnias had gathered rain in the folds of their petals. Some blooms leaned forward as if to whisper secrets into the soil. Others stood tall, refreshed, their colors deepened by the rinse. Bees were absent this evening. Their work paused until the flowers dried. In their place, a few small moths had begun their twilight dance, wings catching the last gold of the day. At the tomato vines, Elias brushed a leaf and felt the cool kiss of water against his fingertips. The scent that rose was richer than usual, mingling with the damp smell of the soil below. Drops clung to the fruit like clear marbles, each holding a tiny inverted reflection of the garden. Past the cucumbers, the herb bed was a tapestry of water and green. Rosemary stems shone dark and fragrant, their needles catching the light in fine lines. Sage leaves held puddles in their broad cups, while thyme glistened with pinpricks of silver. Elias pinched a sprig of mint, releasing its cool breath into the moist air, and the scent mingled with the smell of rain until it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. The gate ahead looked almost polished, its wood darkened by the rain, the grain showing deeper contrasts. The latch bore a few lingering drops, and when Elias touched it, his skin came away cool and damp. He rested his hand there a moment, feeling the moisture soak into his palm. The wood surface smooth under the thin film of water. Beyond the fence, the field wore a new color, richer, as if the rain had brought the green up from its roots. The grasses swayed slightly, heavy-tipped with wet, their motion slower and more deliberate. From the creek came the sound of water moving more urgently than before, a fuller voice threading through the quiet. As he stood there, another memory rose, gentle and whole. It was a summer long past, and he had been a boy again, standing barefoot in the yard after a sudden shower. His mother had let him run outside once the rain eased, and he'd splash through the puddles forming between the rows of beans. The smell of wet earth had seemed enormous then, something that filled his lungs and made him giddy. He'd cupped his hands under the downspout to catch the last of the runoff, watching the water fill his small palms before spilling over. When he came back to the porch, dripping and breathless, his mother had been waiting with the towel, her hands warm against his shoulders as she drew him inside. "You smell like the garden after rain," she had said, and in her voice there had been something like pride. The memory settled into the present as easily as the rain had settled into the soil. Elias lifted the latch now, letting the gate open with a quiet sigh. The cat slipped through ahead of him, stepping lightly on the damp earth. Together they stood just beyond the fence, breathing in the fullness of the evening. The sun was low enough now that its light came in sideways, striking the drops still clinging to the grasses. They caught fire for a moment, turning the field into a scattered constellation. Insects hummed softly in the wetter corners, and far down the creek, a frog's low call answered the day's ending. Elias closed the gate gently, the latch clicking into place with its familiar tone. On the walk back, he let his fingers trail through the rosemary, across the cool skins of the cucumbers, over the damp petals of the zinnias. Each touch left a trace of water on his skin, as if the garden were offering him a piece of its renewal. By the time he reached the porch, the cat had already taken its place on the top step, paws tucked neatly, eyes half shut. Elias paused, looking back once more. The gate stood dark against the brightening blue of the sky, its wet boards catching the last gleam of daylight. He stepped inside then, the smell of rain following him through the door, mingling with the warm scent of the house. The garden would rest now, its thirst quenched, its roots holding the memory of the afternoon's gift. And tomorrow, the path to the gate would wait again, softened and fresh under his feet. By the seventh evening, the air had changed in a way that Elias could not quite name, though he felt it the moment he stepped onto the porch. It wasn't colder, not exactly. The sun still warmed the boards beneath his feet, and the air still carried the sweetness of summer. But there was a shift, subtle as a note added to a familiar chord, something that hinted at the season waiting just beyond the horizon. It came in the way the light seemed softer, as though filtered through a fine haze. It came in the scent of the garden, where the green of leaves was tempered now by the dry edge of stems beginning to tire. It came in the small restlessness of the birds, whose calls were sharper and more insistent, as if they were already thinking of the long flights ahead. The cat, always an early reader of such changes, moved differently too. Tonight it did not linger on the steps or wander the porch rail. Instead, it set off ahead of him as soon as he began to move, tail carried high, paws finding the grass with the confidence of one who knows exactly where it's going. Elias followed at his usual pace, each step bending the grass that was just beginning to lose its summer lushness. The blades were cooler now, the soil beneath them firmer after days without rain. A faint rustle accompanied his walk, not from wind, but from the dry undersides of leaves brushing against one another. The zinnias stood as they had all season, but their colors seemed deeper under this softer light. Reds like the skin of ripe apples, oranges like the edge of a late-day sun, pinks with the first hint of mauve, each bloom carrying the weight of the weeks it had stood in the garden. A few petals had begun to curl at the edges, a reminder that nothing, not even beauty at its height, can remain unchanged. At the tomato vines, Elias saw the first yellowing of the lower leaves. The fruit was plentiful still, each one warm to the touch, but the plants had begun to give themselves over to ripening rather than growth. He held one in his palm, feeling its weight, its readiness, and thought how the garden never seemed to mourn such transitions. It simply moved on, certain of the rhythm that had shaped it from the start. Past the cucumbers, the herb bed was alive with scent. The rosemary had grown woodier, its needles darker and stronger under the fingers. The sage leaves were thicker now, their silver-green faces slightly rougher to the touch. Even the thyme had a denser fragrance, as though it too had been storing the season's warmth for what was to come. The mint, still bright and insistent, sent up a coolness into the air that felt almost like a promise of the frost to come. Elias pinched a sprig and held it to his nose. It was the same scent as in summer, yet tonight it carried a crispness that made him think of evenings when breath would hang visible in the air. The gate waited at the end of the path, its top slat catching the last light in a thin band of gold. Elias rested his hand there, feeling the faint warmth left from the day. The wood surface was dry under his palm, and he noticed how the grain showed more sharply in this angled light, each line a record of seasons past. Beyond the fence, the field seemed quieter than usual. The grasses swayed only slightly, and the sounds from the creek were muffled, as if the water too was listening for something. High above, a small flock of birds passed in a loose formation, their wings catching the sun's fading fire before they slipped into the shadow beyond the hill. Standing there, Elias remembered another first hint of autumn many years ago. He had been walking home from school along the dirt road that curved past the edge of the family's field. The air had smelled of cut hay, and in the hedgerows the first sumac leaves had turned red. His mother had been waiting at the gate then, a basket on her arm filled with apples from the tree near the barn. She had waved without calling out, letting the sight of her be enough to draw him closer. When he reached her, she had handed him an apple, cool from the shade, sweet in a way that could only belong to late summer, turning toward fall. They had walked back to the house together, the basket between them, the path soft with dry grass underfoot. That apple, its flavor, and the way the day felt had stayed with him far longer than he could explain. The memory faded into the present dusk. Elias lifted the latch and stepped through the gate. The cat followed, pausing just beyond the fence to look out over the field. Together, they stood in the open air, breathing in the mingled scents of summer and the season to come. The sun was low now, the light stretched thin across the land. Insects hummed in the hedgerows, their song slower and steadier than in high summer. A single leaf drifted down from the old maple near the creek, landing without sound in the grass. Elias closed the gate softly and began the walk back. The garden seemed to meet him halfway, its familiar scents and shapes gathering around him as the light deepened. The zinnias bowed in the still air, the tomatoes glowed faintly in their cages, and the herbs breathed out their evening fragrance. By the time he reached the porch, the cat had taken its place on the top step. Eyes bright in the dimming light, Elias paused before opening the door, looking once more toward the gate. Against the deepening blue of the sky, it stood steady, holding the space between what had been and what was coming. Inside, the warmth of the house waited, but outside, the first note of autumn lingered in the air, gentle and sure, as if it had always been there, simply waiting for someone to notice. By the 8th evening, autumn's hand was a little more certain in its touch. The air was still warm enough to walk without a coat, but it no longer wrapped itself around the body in the soft, unbroken way of summer. It moved differently now, layered, textured, carrying the weight of scents and sounds that belonged only to this time between seasons. Elias opened the screen door and stepped onto the porch, greeted first by the smell of wood smoke drifting from a chimney somewhere beyond the creek. It was thin, not the heavy smoke of winter fires, but a light, exploratory kind, as though someone had lit a small blaze in the stove just to test the season. Mixed with it was the scent of dry leaves, warmed by the day and now releasing their edge into the cooling air. The cat was already in the yard, crouched low as it watched something moving in the grass. A cricket, perhaps, or a moth resting after its first few dusk flights. When it noticed him, it stood, tail curling like a question mark, and padded toward the path. The grass had grown slightly rougher underfoot, the blades losing some of their summer softness. Each step made a faint, crisp sound as he walked. Above him, the old maple by the fence let a few leaves go, one after another, each falling with its own slow, tumbling rhythm. The zinnias were still bright, but their stems had stiffened, and some blooms now carried the faded blush of age. Bees moved more quickly among them, perhaps sensing the shortening days. A single butterfly, a pale yellow one, fluttered lazily over the row, settling for a moment on a bloom before lifting again into the mild wind. At the tomato vines, the air was heavy with ripeness. Elias picked one this time, turning it in his hand, feeling its smooth skin warm from the day's sun. He held it up to his face and inhaled deeply, letting the sharp, sweet scent of the fruit mix with the earthy smell of the soil at his feet. It was a scent that had been part of every late summer he could remember, unchanged across decades, and he knew it would follow him indoors later, clinging faintly to his fingers. The herb bed released its own voice into the air, rosemary's pine-like strength, sage's grounding weight, and the fresh, almost metallic cool of mint rose with each step. A gust of wind passed through just then, stirring the plants and carrying their fragrance down the path toward the gate, as if inviting him forward. The gate was waiting in the last golden light, its shadow stretching long behind it. Beyond the fence, the field was alive with motion, not hurried, but constant. The wind moved in wide sweeps across the grasses, pressing them flat for a heartbeat before letting them rise again. Somewhere in that sweep, a sound rose above the rustle, the faint, clear calls of geese. Elias looked up. Far above the field, a V-shaped line was moving across the pale sky, the birds' wings catching the last hints of sunlight. Their voices carried an uneven rhythm, some calls sharp and close, others fading into the air behind them. The sound stirred something in him that was both a longing and a settling, the way certain seasonal sounds can anchor a person to both past and present at once. He remembered a time, decades ago, when he had been walking home from the far pasture with his father. The geese had flown overhead that day too, their voices even louder in the clear air. His father had paused in the path, tilted his head and said, "That's the sound of the world moving on." At the time, Elias hadn't thought much of it, but now, standing at the gate, he understood that his father had meant more than the changing of seasons. He had meant that life in all its forms carries forward whether or not we are ready. The geese disappeared beyond the tree line, their calls fading into a memory before they were even gone. Elias stayed still for a while longer, listening to the quieter voices that followed, the creak of the gate in the breeze, the low hum of insects in the hedge, the faint trickle of water from the creek where it met a curve of stones. When he finally lifted the latch and stepped through, the cat followed close at his heel. They walked only a few paces into the field, far enough to let the wind pass cleanly over them. The grasses here were cool and slightly damp near their roots. Every so often a grasshopper sprang away, clicking its wings before disappearing into the thick growth again. The scent of smoke returned, mingling now with the sharper tang of the field. Somewhere nearby, a neighbor must have stoked their small fire, and Elias imagined the warmth of it, the way the flames must be curling around a few split logs. He closed the gate gently and started back. The garden greeted him in its familiar order, zinnias leaning toward the path, tomatoes glowing faintly in the fading light, herbs brushing against his legs with their evening fragrance. At the porch, He paused as he often did, turning for one last look. The gate stood at the far end of the path, the light behind it gone now, leaving it silhouetted against the soft blue of the sky. Above it, a single leaf spiraled down from the maple, drifting to rest just inside the fence. Inside, the house was warm, and the smell of supper would soon fill the rooms. But for now, he stood a little longer in the quiet, letting the voices of the evening, wind, geese, water, and leaves settle into him, each one carrying its own gentle truth. The world moves on, and so do we, but always in the company of what we've loved. By the 9th evening, the day had been quieter than most. The sky had worn a thin veil of cloud since morning, softening the sun's reach and leaving the light pale and even. There had been no wind, no restless shift in the air, only the steady breathing of the land as it went about its work. But now, as Elias stepped onto the porch, the air was different, cooler, with a dampness that promised mist before the night had fully arrived. Already, the far end of the field looked softened, as if distance itself had blurred. The edges of the garden were losing their sharpness, the zinnias standing like gentle flames in a world just beginning to fade into blue. The cat was waiting on the second step, eyes bright in the dim light, tail wrapped neatly around its paws. It rose as Elias began his walk, padding ahead without hurry, its small body moving silently through the gathering moisture in the grass. The path felt cool beneath his bare feet, the blades of grass already damp enough to darken his skin. With each step, the smell of earth rose, deep and quiet, the scent of soil settling in for the night. The zinnias glowed faintly in the muted light, their colors softened by the mist. Bees were gone now, replaced by the occasional moth drifting past on powdery wings. One brushed against his arm, leaving a sensation so light it might have been imagined. At the tomato vines, droplets had begun to form on the lower leaves, tiny beads catching what little light remained. The fruit, still warm from the day, stood out in richer contrast against the cooling air. Elias touched one and felt the faint give beneath its skin, a quiet readiness. He left it in place, content to know it would be waiting tomorrow. The herb bed seemed more fragrant in this dampness. Rosemary's sharpness was tempered, sage carried a faint sweetness, and the mint released its cool scent in sudden bursts as he brushed against it. The air here felt thicker, holding each fragrance longer before letting it drift away. The gate appeared gradually, its outline emerging from the mist like an old friend stepping out of memory. The wood was darker now, the grain more pronounced in the low light. Elias placed his palm on the top slat, feeling the coolness of the evening seep into his skin. Beyond the fence, the field was a muted expanse, the grasses swaying only slightly. The creek's voice was louder in the stillness, its rhythm steady and low. And above it all, a pale moon had begun to rise, blurred at the edges by the thin mist curling upward from the ground. Standing there, Elias thought of other evenings when the mist had come early. One in particular rose in his mind. He had been no older than 20, walking the same path after a long day of haying. The air then had been heavy with the scent of cut grass, and the mist had rolled in like a tide across the lower pasture. He had paused at the gate that night, leaning on it with arms tired from work, and watched the fog fold itself over the land. The moon had been nearly full, turning the mist into a silver sea. It had felt, for that brief time, like standing at the edge of another world. The present evening held something of that same quiet magic. He lifted the latch and stepped through, the cat slipping silently after him. In the field, the mist curled around their legs, cool against the skin, while above them the moon's light spread gently across the land. They walked only a short way, far enough for the garden to fade into shadow behind them. The air was still, save for the soft rustle of grass underfoot and the occasional plunk of water from the creek as a fish disturbed its surface. Elias breathed in deeply. The scents here were layered, the damp green of grass, the faint sweetness of clover, the mineral coolness rising from the earth. Each one seemed to settle into him, as if the mist carried not just water, but the memory of every evening like this that had ever been. When they turned back, the gate was a darker shape in the mist, its familiar line steady and sure. Elias closed it gently behind them, the latch clicking softly. The cat brushed against his leg before darting ahead toward the porch, where the lamplight was beginning to glow. The walk back was slower than usual. The herbs, the zinnias, the tomatoes, each seemed to hold its own small halo of moisture, breathing out fragrance into the cool air. By the time he reached the porch, his skin carried the scent of them all, woven together like threads in a well-used quilt. He paused at the door, looking back once more. The mist was rising higher now, hiding the lower slats of the gate, leaving only its top bar visible in the moonlight. It seemed, in that moment, less a barrier and more a promise, that no matter how much the world around it changed or faded, it would stand there, keeping its quiet watch. Elias stepped inside, the cool dampness following him for just a moment before the warmth of the house closed around him. Behind him, the garden and the gate settled into the mist, holding the night gently, the way one might hold a sleeping child. By the 10th evening, the mist from the night before had thinned and drawn back into the low ground, leaving the air clear and open. The moon, nearly full, had risen early, claiming the sky before the last traces of daylight were gone. It hung there like a lantern in the east, pale but steady, pouring its light across the field and garden until everything wore the same soft silver. From the porch, Elias could see the way the moonlight caught in the upper leaves of the maple, turning them into a trembling lattice of white and shadow. The air was cool enough to sharpen each scent, the grass, the earth, the faint sweetness of the last summer blooms. Somewhere beyond the creek, a dog gave a single bark, then settled back into silence. The cat was stretched out along the porch rail, eyes half closed, but when Elias stepped down onto the boards, it rose in one fluid motion and followed him. The two of them moved together toward the path, the moonlight spreading before them as if it had been laid there in welcome. The grass underfoot was still damp in places from the night air, and each blade seemed to hold its own sliver of light. Elias walked more slowly than usual, not because he was tired, but because the beauty of it seemed to ask for slower steps. The garden looked different at night, less a place for tending, more a place for keeping watch. The zinnias, with their colors muted in the silver wash, appeared almost made of paper, each petal finely cut, each fold and curl given shape by shadow. No bees now, only the quiet rustle of a night moth here and there, their wings whispering against the blooms. At the tomato vines, the fruit was darker, their shine dulled by the absence of the sun. Still, they seemed fuller somehow, as if the night air had deepened their flavor. Elias brushed a hand along the leaves, releasing the green scent that clung to his skin, and thought how this smell, earthy and sharp, was one of the surest ways to know summer was still with them, if only for a little while longer. The herb bed was quieter too, though the rosemary still held its strong, clean voice. The sage leaves shone faintly, their silvery fuzz catching the light, and the thyme lay low and still, as if sleeping. When he bent to touch the mint, the cool scent rose and then lingered, mixed with the coolness already in the air. The gate came into view slowly, as it always did, but tonight it seemed almost part of the moonlight itself. Its lines softened, its edges blurred just enough to make it seem older, wiser. Elias rested his hand on the top slat, the wood cool under his palm, and let his gaze drift beyond the fence. The field lay wide and unbroken, the moonlight pouring across it until each grass blade was tipped in silver. The creek was visible tonight, its surface bright where the light touched it, moving in slow curves through the land. Above, the stars were faint but steady, each one holding its place in the clear sky. As he stood there, a memory rose, not sharply, but in the gentle way a tide comes in. It was years ago, a night much like this one. He had been a boy, no more than 12, sitting on the top rail of the fence beside his father. They hadn't been speaking, just watching the field in the moonlight. His father had pointed to the far end, where the land dipped, and said, "That's where the mist comes from. It'll be here before midnight." They had sat together for a long while, saying little, listening to the frogs and the night insects, until the mist began to curl toward them, slow and certain. When it reached the fence, his father had nodded, as though to confirm that the world had once again kept its quiet promise. The memory slipped away, leaving Elias with the sound of the creek and the soft brush of grass in the wind. He lifted the latch and stepped through, the cat close behind. Out in the field, the light was even brighter, the moon unbroken by any cloud. Their shadows stretched long and clear, crossing the silvered grass. They didn't walk far, just enough to stand in the open, to feel the space around them. The night was full of quiet sounds, the small shift of an animal in the hedgerow, the ripple of water over stone, the faint hum of wings as a night bird passed overhead. Elias breathed in deeply. The air was cool but not cold, and each breath seemed to carry with it a kind of calm that settled deeper than words. When they turned back toward the garden, the gate stood ahead, framed in moonlight. The cat went first, slipping through before Elias closed the latch with its soft, familiar click. The walk back was unhurried, the garden now resting entirely in shadow, its shapes and scents blending into the night. At the porch, he paused as always, looking back one more time. The gate was only a dark line now against the brightness of the field, but it stood as steady as it always had, marking the edge, keeping the space, holding the memory of every evening walk that had brought him here. Inside, the lamp would be warm, and the chair by the window would offer its quiet comfort. But for a moment longer, Elias stayed outside, letting the silver night wrap around him, letting it remind him that some things, light on a field, the sound of a creek, the company of an old gate, are enough to keep a heart steady. The change came quietly, the way most lasting changes do. That afternoon, the light had been softer than usual, almost shy, as if it was testing its place in the longer evenings ahead. By the time the sun had settled low behind the maples, a breeze had begun to move through the valley. Not the restless wind of summer storms, but a slow, steady breath that carried with it the first full promise of autumn. Elias had been mending a hinge on the shed door when he noticed it. He stopped working, leaning against the frame for a moment, and breathed in. The air was different, cooler on the skin and scented with something far off yet familiar. It was the smell of apples still hanging on branches in the orchards beyond the ridge. Even without seeing them, he could picture their weight, red and gold against the deepening green of the leaves, each one holding the stored light of summer inside its skin. By the time he stepped onto the porch, the sky had shifted into that blue-gray the land wears before the stars begin their slow reveal. The breeze moved steadily now, brushing along the eaves, stirring the leaves in the tall walnut tree near the gate. The cat was already at the edge of the steps, tail flicking once before it began its familiar, measured walk toward the path. Elias followed, his boots left behind. This was a night for feeling the ground directly. The boards of the porch gave way to the cool grass, each blade bending gently under his weight before springing back. The garden looked both the same and not the same in this new air. The zinnias still held their proud shapes, but the wind teased them into a slow dance, their petals shifting like small bright flags. The herb bed seemed livelier too, every leaf quivering, releasing more of its scent into the moving air. Rosemary gave its clean, sharp voice, sage added its earthbound calm. The mint broke into sudden notes of coolness when touched by the breeze. At the tomato vines, the leaves trembled and the fruit swayed slightly on their stems. The wind here was stronger, as if it had gathered speed from the open field beyond. Elias paused, his fingers resting on a cluster of ripening tomatoes, feeling the warmth still caught in their skin despite the evening's coolness. When the gate came into sight, it was moving too, just slightly, rocking on its hinges in rhythm with the wind. Elias placed his hand on the top slat, steadying it for a moment, though it didn't need steadying. The latch clicked softly when he lifted it, and the wind pressed gently against the open frame as if it had been waiting for this small permission to pass through. Beyond the fence, the field was alive in a way it hadn't been the night before. The grasses bent in long, slow waves, their motion carrying all the way to the far hedge. The wind moved steadily toward him, bringing with it the orchard's scent more clearly now, sweet and faintly tart, like a memory that rises just enough to be known, but never enough to be held completely. He stepped through, the cat slipping by with the low flick of its tail, and together they stood in the open. The breeze tugged lightly at his shirts, brushed the hair at his temples, and filled his lungs with the kind of air that leaves you both more awake and more at rest. The sound of the orchard came with it, not as voices or movement, but as a kind of hush beneath the wind, as though the trees were holding something sacred in their branches. Elias thought of the years when he had gone there at this season, basket in hand, to pick fruit alongside neighbors. The rhythm of reaching, twisting, placing, each apple carefully set, never dropped, had been a language in itself, one that needed no words. Tonight the orchard was too far to see, yet near enough to change the air where he stood. He imagined the moonlight when it came, sliding across the round shoulders of the apples, settling into the dips where stems met skin. He imagined the quiet of that place, the sound of the wind working its way through the rows, carrying the scent across the ridge to the garden and the gate. The cat wandered a little ahead, nose low to the ground, tail high in the air. Elias followed at a pace set by the night itself. No need for hurry, no reason to measure the walk in anything but the rise and fall of the wind. When they should turn back toward home, the gate waited in its place. the breeze moving past it, through it, around it. Elias paused with his hand on the latch, feeling the smooth, weathered wood under his palm. There was a comfort in knowing that some things could move and still remain exactly where they belonged. The walk back through the garden was a path of scents, the herbs stirred by the wind, the zinnias leaning into it, the soil breathing up its coolness. Each step seemed to carry the orchard's whisper a little farther until, by the time he reached the porch, the air around him felt both changed and familiar at once. Inside, the lamplight would be steady, the house warm, but Elia lingered outside a moment longer, letting the breeze pass over him, letting it bring what it carried from beyond the ridge. The apples would be ready soon. He would walk there when the time came. For now, it was enough to stand by the gate, the wind moving freely through, the night offering its quiet gifts to anyone willing to pause long enough to receive them. That evening, the air carried a different note. It was not the green sharpness of summer grass, nor the crisp sweetness of the early apple wind from the night before. This was deeper, slower, and warm, the scent of wood smoke, rising from somewhere beyond the garden, curling into the cooling sky. Elias noticed it first as he stood by the kitchen window, rinsing his hands in the basin. The day had been quiet, unhurried, just small work in the shed, a slow sorting of seeds, a letter answered in his careful, looping hand. Outside, the light was already leaning toward dusk, brushing the edges of the maples with the softer gold. He turned off the tap and dried his hands on the old linen towel that hung by the door. Then, as if drawn by that faint scent in the air, he stepped out onto the porch. The cat was waiting, already aware of their nightly walk. It padded down the steps without looking back, certain that Elias would follow. And of course, he did. The first touch of the garden path was cool beneath his soles. The zinnias had begun to close themselves for the night, their colors dimming in the falling light, though each still held a whisper of brightness. The herb bed gave its familiar greeting as he passed, the rosemary brisk and clean, the sage calm and grounding, the mint still fresh from the afternoon sun. The scent of smoke wove itself into these garden smells in a way that felt natural, as though it had always belonged. It was faint enough to let the herbs and soil keep their voices, yet steady enough that Elias knew it was more than a passing breeze. Somewhere, perhaps in the village beyond the ridge, someone had lit their hearth early. The gate stood ahead in its usual patience, the top rail catching the last of the evening light. When Elias reached it, he rested his hand on the weathered wood, feeling the familiar grain under his fingers. The latch lifted easily, the click sounding soft in the stillness. Stepping through, he let his gaze stretch out over the field. The smoke scent was clearer here, carried low across the grass by the slow-moving air. It stirred something in him, not the orchard memories of work and baskets, but a quieter recollection. Older, tucked deep into the folds of childhood, he was 8, perhaps 9, sitting by his grandmother's stove on an October evening. Outside, the air had been cold enough to silver the breath, but in that small kitchen, the warmth from the fire was almost drowsy. She had been making soup, her movements unhurried, the wooden spoon scraping softly against the pot. The smell of the wood fire had been in everything, the bread on the table, the sleeves of his shirt, even in the folds of the curtain by the window. Later that night, as he lay in bed under a quilt heavy enough to still his restless legs, the scent of the smoke had followed him into sleep. It was the kind of scent that didn't just belong to a place, but to a season, a marker that the long, slow evenings had arrived and that home would hold them safely through the darker months. The memory eased away, and Elias stood once more in the field, the breeze moving around him in its unhurried way. The cat had settled in the grass a few steps ahead, tail wrapped neatly around its body, eyes half closed in contentment. Beyond the ridge, a faint orange glow hinted at the source of the smoke, someone's chimney, or perhaps the edge of a small outdoor fire. The glow was steady, and though he could not see the flames, he imagined the logs settling into coals, the occasional spark rising, the smoke carrying its quiet message outward into the night. He lingered by the gate longer than usual before turning back. The return through the garden felt slower, as though each step was measured to match the rhythm of the breeze. Passing the herb bed, he breathed deeply, the rosemary sharper now against the smoke's warmth, the mint like a cool thread woven through. On the porch, he paused, hand resting lightly on the rail. The scent of the smoke was fainter here, nearly folded into the night air, but it was still there, enough to carry that old reassurance. The world was settling into itself for the evening, and there was time, always time, for rest. Inside, the lamp would be lit, the chair by the window waiting. The cat would curl itself into its chosen corner, and the quiet would settle in like a quilt. Elias stepped toward the door, knowing the gate would stand where it always had, holding the night gently at the garden's edge. The night arrived softly, without the usual ceremony of a sunset flaring against the horizon. The day's light had simply loosened its hold, allowing the blue to deepen until it became something closer to slate. In that fading, a thin crescent of moon appeared, so pale it almost hid in the sky, like a small, shy smile that didn't wish to be noticed too soon. Elias first saw it through the kitchen window as he poured warm water into a mug. The steam rose slowly, curling upward and disappearing before it reached the pane. He let the cup rest in his hands for a moment, feeling its weight and warmth. Outside, the first threads of mist were already beginning to form in the low part of the field, clinging to the earth as if reluctant to rise. He sipped once, then set the mug down beside the lamp. The cat had already appeared at the door, its quiet posture making clear that the evening walk was not to be forgotten. The air was cooler than the night before, carrying with it the damp, earthy scent of mist. Stepping from the porch, Elias felt the softness of the grass beneath his bare feet, a different softness than in the heat of summer. It was cooler now, the moisture gathering against the skin, not unpleasant, but grounding in a way that reminded him of the land's slow preparations for the season ahead. The herb bed gave a muted fragrance in the dampness. Rosemary was darker, sage more hushed, and the mint's brightness seemed folded in on itself, waiting for the day's warmth to return. The zinnias, their colors muted in the moon's faint glow, leaned slightly toward one another as if for comfort. By the time he reached the garden gate, the mist had thickened over the field. It wasn't a heavy fog, just enough to soften the edges of the world. The fence posts along the far side of the field were only suggestions now, pale against the darker grass. The gate's hinges made their familiar small sound when Elias lifted the latch, a note so quiet it might have belonged to the night itself. He stepped through and the air seemed to change. It wrapped around him more closely, cool and damp, carrying the faintest scent of fallen leaves from somewhere along the far hedge. The cat walked ahead, its shape occasionally fading into the low cloud before reappearing. tail held high in its unhurried confidence. Mist had always held a certain pull for Elias. He remembered walking through it as a boy, the way it could make the most ordinary path seem like a road to somewhere forgotten. Even the smallest fields became wider, the smallest woods deeper. The world felt both familiar and changed, as if it had been turned inside out while no one was looking. One autumn evening, many years ago, he had walked home from the village in such a mist. The lantern he carried made only a small circle of light around his feet, and beyond it, everything else was suggestion and shadow. The road was one he had walked 100 times, yet that night it had felt like entering a dream. Standing now in the field, Elias let that old memory settle beside the present moment. The crescent moon hung low and pale above him, its light thin but steady, painting a faint silver line along the tops of the mist. The air was still, and the only sounds were the quiet drip of condensation from a nearby fence post and the muted rustle of the cat in the grass. He stayed there for a while, letting the damp air find its way into his shirt sleeves, feeling the coolness of it on his skin. There was no hurry to return. The mist made it easy to believe that time itself had slowed its pace, walking alongside them instead of rushing ahead. When he finally turned back toward the garden, the gate appeared slowly through the haze, as if it had been waiting in silence for his return. Passing through, he let the latch fall into place with its soft click, a sound that seemed almost like the closing of a book whose story would continue tomorrow. The garden was quieter now, the mist weaving gently between the rows of herbs and flowers. On the porch, the lamplight from inside spilled out in a warm square, a contrast to the cool silver outside. The cat went ahead into the house, but Elias lingered a moment longer, breathing in the mingled scents of earth, damp air, and that faint sweetness that comes when autumn begins to settle in for good. When he stepped inside at last, the door closed softly behind him, leaving the gate and the mist to keep their watch over the field until morning. The morning had been restless in its weather, shifting from pale sunlight to low, drifting clouds. By afternoon, the air had grown heavier, the way it does when rain has been thinking about arriving all day. Elias noticed the scent first, a cool dampness threading through the open window, carrying the distant murmur of water finding its way through leaves. By the time evening approached, the rain had settled in, not in a sudden downpour, but in a quiet, steady fall, the kind that seems to have no beginning and no end. The drops tapped gently at the porch roof, moved across the garden in soft silver threads, and vanished into the dark soil without hurry. The sound was its own kind of light, dim and constant without sharpness, making the corners of the house feel warmer than they had in days. Elias let the lamp stay low, its golden glow pooling softly on the wooden table. He stood for a long moment by the back door, looking out through the screen at the blurred edges of the garden. The rosemary, heavy with rain, leaned toward the ground, each leaf jeweled with water. The zinnias bowed their bright heads, their petals darkened by the wet. Even the gate, standing steady at the garden's edge, seemed gentled by the rain's touch. The cat sat on the windowsill, its tail flicking slowly as it watched the silver threads drift across the world. It was not a night for walking, and the animal knew it. Instead, it kept its quiet company near the glass, eyes following every small movement outside. Rain had a way of changing the shape of sound in the village beyond the ridge. The usual faint hum of a cart on the road, or a door closing somewhere in the distance, was softened into almost nothing. Even the crickets seemed to have drawn closer together, their song muted as if spoken into cupped hands. Elias listened to it all as he leaned against the doorframe. The rain spoke in its measured language, a gentle patter on the leaves of the apple tree, a more deliberate drumming on the old tin roof of the shed, a subtle hiss where the drops met the stone path. Each sound carried its own story, woven together into a single, unbroken thread of quiet. Rain had always been a comfort to him. As a boy, he'd lie awake in a small bed and wait for the roof to begin its conversation with the sky. Those nights, the quilts were heavy, and the air in the room carried the faint scent of the wood stove below. The world beyond the walls seemed to dissolve into water and wind, and yet inside everything felt steady, enclosed. His grandmother had once told him that rain at night was a gift. It meant the earth was resting, and so could he. She'd say it in the simple way she said most things, her voice sure without being loud, her hands always in motion with her knitting. Now, years later, Elias found the same truth in the rhythm outside. He stayed by the door until the last light drained from the sky, the rain continuing its steady work in the dark. The gate, at the edge of the garden, was only a shadow now, its lines softened, almost a memory against the darker field beyond. When he turned back into the house, the warmth inside felt like an old friend's hand on his shoulder. He lit the second lamp on the side table, its light catching the curve of the teacup waiting there. The cat followed him, leaping softly to the arm of the chair as Elias settled into it. The sound of the rain was still there, wrapping itself around the house. It did not press in, but held close, as though it meant to keep the walls and all within them safe. Elias sipped his tea, letting the warmth move through him slowly. He thought briefly of the gate outside, standing its quiet watch in the rain. Tomorrow it would be darkened with water, its grain more pronounced, the latch cool to the touch. But tonight, it was simply part of the soft boundary between here and the rest of the world. The rain would fall through the night and perhaps into the next day. There was no need to hurry through it. The garden would drink deeply, the herbs would be refreshed, and the soil would remember. Inside, Elias let his eyes rest on the lamplight, the steam curling from his cup, and the slow, measured conversation of rain against the earth. All of it, together, was enough. The rain had gone some time before dawn, leaving behind a stillness so complete that even the smallest sound seemed magnified. When Elias woke, the air in the room carried that unmistakable scent, the clean, sweet mix of damp earth and green things washed new. It was the kind of fragrance that could make a person pause before even opening their eyes, content to lie there and breathe. The light was different too, softer than usual. It filtered through the thin curtains as if it had been strained through water. Elias sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, letting his bare feet find the familiar worn rug. The boards beneath were cool, and from somewhere beyond the window came the slow, measured call of a mourning dove. By the time he stepped onto the porch, the sun had risen just enough to scatter a pale gold across the garden. Every leaf, every blade of grass, every petal held a small jewel of water, trembling but unfalling. The zinnias stood straighter than they had the night before, their colors deepened by the rain's touch. The rosemary and sage, still heavy with droplets, released their scent more freely in the warming air. He could hear the faintest drip from the corner of the shed, where rainwater had gathered on the roof overnight and was now finding its way down, one drop at a time. Beyond the garden, the field shone in a soft green haze. the mist of early morning still lingering low over the grass. The gate stood there as it always did, quiet, patient, its wood darkened by the night soaking. The latch caught the light in a small, glinting curve. Elias found himself walking toward it without hurry, his steps silent on the damp earth. When he opened the gate, it moved with a slower creak than usual, the moisture in its joints giving the sound a softer edge. Outside the garden, the field felt newly made, as though the rain had smoothed away every mark of yesterday. The path ahead was bordered with wildflowers whose petals were still closed, each cradling a bead of water like a secret. Elias stood there for a while, just breathing. The cool air filled his chest in a way that was both bracing and tender. It was not the sharp cold of winter, but the kind that wakes the mind gently, the way a friend might lay a hand on your shoulder to stir you from sleep. He remembered mornings like this from his boyhood, how, after a night of rain, the world seemed somehow both quieter and more alive. His father would sometimes take him out to check the fence lines, and they would walk together in that same softened light, their boots dark with dew. They would speak little, stopping now and then to watch a rabbit dart across the wet grass or to listen for the far-off sound of the creek running high after the rain. Those mornings had a way of staying with him, not in the details, but in the feeling. A steady, unhurried kind of peace that seemed to hold everything in place. He felt it now, standing by the open gate with the field stretching out before him. The cat had followed him out, its paws making no sound at all on the damp path. It paused just beyond the gate, sniffing the air as if considering whether the world beyond was worth exploring today. After a moment, it sat down, curling its tail around its feet, content to simply share the view. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called once, its voice cutting through the soft morning air without breaking it. Elias leaned against the gatepost, watching the light grow stronger as the sun climbed behind the low clouds. Each moment seemed to unfold slowly, as though the day itself had decided not to rush. When he finally turned back toward the house, the garden greeted him with its quiet abundance. The herbs brushed lightly against his legs as he passed, leaving their fragrance on his skin. On the porch, the wooden boards were still damp beneath his feet, and the door gave its small, familiar sigh as he opened it. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of bread rising in the oven. The kettle on the stove had begun to hum softly, promising tea to go with the morning stillness. Elias poured the water and sat at the table, the cat curling into its usual place by the window. Outside, the gate stood open just a little, as if to remind him that the world beyond was always there, patient, waiting, and ready to be walked into whenever he chose. The rain had left more than just freshness in the air. It had also left the old gate with the slow, tired sway in its hinges. That morning, when Elias had gone out to check the latch, it had leaned just slightly, as if it had carried too many seasons on its shoulders. It still closed with its familiar sound, but the creak had deepened, more of a groan now than the easy sigh it used to give. He noticed it in the quiet way a person notices an old friend's limp, without judgment, only with a soft resolve to help set things right. After breakfast, Elias gathered what he needed from the shed: a small tin of oil, a cloth, a worn file, and an old hammer whose wooden handle had long ago taken the shape of his hand. The tools clinked softly as he set them down on the porch rail, and the cat, ever curious, came to investigate before losing interest and curling up in the strip of sunlight that had found its way to the boards. The garden was still drying from the night's rain. Droplets hung on the rosemary like clear beads, and when the breeze passed, they shook loose and fell silently into the dark soil. The gate stood there at the far end, patient and uncomplaining, though its wooden frame had darkened to the color of deep tea from the soaking. Elias walked toward it slowly, enjoying the way the grass gave beneath his boots, still soft from the rain. Each step carried him not just closer to the gate, but further back in memory, to mornings when he had followed his father down similar paths, tools in hand, to tend to something small but important. He set the tin of oil on the low post beside the gate and ran his fingers over the grain of the wood. It felt cool and slightly rough beneath his touch. The latch still caught with a firm click, but the weight of the gate pulled against it in a way that suggested the hinges needed more than just a little oil. Kneeling, Elias brushed away the thin film of grit that had gathered where metal met wood. The scent of the damp earth rose around him, mingling with the faint, sharp tang of the iron. He worked slowly, not out of necessity, but because there was no need for hurry. The cloth in his hand moved with care over the hinge pins, wiping away the fine rust that had bloomed there. He poured a single drop of oil where the pin met the hinge plate, watching it darken the metal as it sank in. The gate responded with a gentler creak when he tested it, though there was still more to do. It was work that required little thought and much attention, the kind of task where the hands could move almost on their own while the mind wandered. Elias thought of his father again, remembering the way he had always approached such repairs with a steady patience, as though the gate or fence post he worked on could somehow feel the care in his touch. "Never force a thing to fit," his father had said once, adjusting a loose hinge on the barn door. "Let it tell you where it's tired, and meet it there." Those words came back now, as clear as the rasp of the file against the hinge edge. Elias worked until the metal edges were smooth again, the resistance gone from the latch. The gate swung easily, not with the lightness of something new, but with the sure, quiet movement of something restored. When he stepped back to see it whole, the light had shifted in the garden. The mist from morning had burned away, leaving the air clear and touched with the scent of warming herbs. Beyond the gate, the field shimmered faintly in the sun, and a hawk circled high against the pale sky. Elias leaned against the post, not ready to leave just yet. He let his eyes trace the shape of the gate, the worn curve of the top rail, the small knot in the wood where a branch had once grown, the grain that caught the light like threads in a fabric. It was a simple thing, this gate, but in its own way it was a keeper of time, opening and closing on seasons, holding the quiet boundary between the life within the garden and the world beyond. He closed it gently, listening for the new sound it made, a softer creak now, the kind that promised it would last through many more evenings at dusk, many more mornings after rain. The latch clicked home with the satisfying certainty of a task done well. Walking back toward the house, Elias carried the tools in one hand, the tin of oil balanced carefully in the other. The cat had not moved far, now stretched along the sun-warmed boards, half asleep. The smell of the garden followed him inside, and when he set the tools on the counter, he felt that quiet, almost invisible satisfaction that comes from tending to something that matters, even if only to you. By mid-afternoon, the rain-washed day had settled into a soft, steady quiet. The air was neither warm nor cool, but something in between, a temperature that asked nothing from you, as if the world had decided you could simply rest. Elias had brought his tea to the porch, setting it on the low table beside his chair. The steam curled slowly upward, carrying with it the faint sweetness of chamomile and honey. The porch boards were still holding the warmth of the sun. He could feel it through the soles of his slippers as he eased back in the chair, the one with the smooth curved arms worn by years of leaning. Beyond the railing, the garden seemed almost to be listening to itself. The leaves of the apple tree shifted in a breeze so light it hardly bent them, and from somewhere near the fence came the sound of a bee's slow, looping path from blossom to blossom. The repaired gate stood at the far end of the garden, half in shadow now. It no longer leaned, but rested in its place as though it had found its balance again. Every so often, when the breeze rose just a little, the latch gave a gentle rattle. Nothing urgent, only the sort of sound that folded itself into the day's stillness. Elias sipped his tea and let his eyes wander. He watched a small bird, a wren perhaps, land on the top rail of the gate. Its feathers were a soft brown, almost blending into the weathered wood, and it tilted its head as if deciding whether to enter the garden. After a moment, it hopped down to the path just inside, pecked at something unseen, then fluttered away toward the rosemary bush. Such small visitations pleased him in ways he could never quite explain. They reminded him of afternoons long ago when he would sit with his grandmother on her own porch, and she would tell him to let the day come to you. At the time, he hadn't understood. He thought you had to go out and find something for the day to be worth remembering. But now, with the years behind him, he understood it well. There was a kind of gift in allowing the world to arrive in its own time. The shadows began to lengthen slowly across the garden. The sun found new angles, lighting the tops of the tall grass beyond the gate until they looked like strands of gold laid across the field. In the quiet, he could hear the faint rustle of wings as swallows traced their wide arcs in the open sky. Somewhere far off, a cow lowed, the sound carrying easily over the soft air. Elias leaned back further, resting his cup on the arm of the chair. He felt the porch boards creak a little under the shift of his weight, an old sound, familiar and reassuring. The cat appeared again, padding silently from the open doorway to claim a patch of sun at his feet. It circled once, then settled, its slow breathing matching the rhythm of the afternoon. A memory surfaced, unhurried, his father sitting much as he was now, a mug in hand, looking out over their own family garden after a day's work. Elias, as a boy, had sat on the steps restless, tapping his heels against the wood. His father had not spoken much, but every so often he would point out something. How the wind bent the grain in waves, how the light changed the color of the leaves, how a hawk's shadow moved faster than its flight. Those lessons had not felt like lessons at the time. They had been moments folded into the day, so ordinary that they almost escaped notice. And yet, here they were, years later, returning like well-worn stones in the pocket of memory. Things to hold on to when the rest of life seemed too sharp. The tea cooled beside him. The breeze carried a faint scent of earth and drying grass, mixing with the floral trace from the cup. He thought of how many afternoons like this had passed, how many more might come. There was comfort in the thought that the gate would be there for each of them, its hinges easy now, its latch steady. Somewhere near the hedgerow, a cricket began its slow, measured song. It was joined after a while by another, until the air held a quiet conversation between them. Elias listened without trying to separate one voice from the other. The rhythm was enough, the reminder that even in stillness, life continued in its small, necessary ways. As the light softened toward evening, he stood and carried the empty cup inside. The cat followed, tail brushing lightly against his leg. He set the cup in the sink but did not wash it yet. Instead, he returned to the doorway and looked out once more at the garden. The gate caught the last of the sun, its wood glowing faintly. Beyond it, the field lay in gentle shadow, waiting for the first cool breath of night. Elias felt no need to close the gate yet. Some things could remain open a little longer, welcoming whatever might wander in before the day was done. The first pale light of dawn found its way into Elias's room, brushing against the curtain as if it were in no hurry to wake him. It was the kind of morning light that seemed to come with its own quiet voice, saying only, "When you're ready." Still half asleep, Elias felt the pull of the early hour, an old instinct from the years when mornings began before the sun rose. He let it draw him up from the warmth of his bed, his feet meeting the cool wood floor with the faintest sound. Outside, the air was almost silver. A light mist hung low over the grass, blurring the edges of the garden and the field beyond the gate. Each blade of grass was tipped with dew, catching the light in small, perfect beads. Elias paused at the porch, breathing in the scent that belonged only to mornings like this, a mingling of damp earth, fresh leaves, and the faint sweetness of something blooming unseen. So the world was still, save for a single bird announcing the day from somewhere near the apple tree. Its call was clear and steady, fallen into the mist as if it might carry across the entire valley. Somewhere far off, a cow answered, its low voice softened by distance. Elias stepped down onto the garden path, his boots darkening where they brushed against the wet grass. The gate stood ahead, a familiar shape in the mist, and he felt the same small tug of anticipation he always did when approaching it. Mornings had a way of making the garden feel new again, even when it had stood unchanged for years. As he reached the gate, his hand rested on the top rail, the wood cool and damp beneath his palm. The latch gave its quiet, willing click as he lifted it, and he stepped out into the field. The mist here was deeper, curling around his legs as he moved, and the grass whispered under his steps. The field sloped gently downward, and he followed the path worn over seasons, by his own boots, and before that, by those of his father and grandfather. The soil here held their footsteps as surely as the wood of the gate held their touch. Halfway across, he stopped to listen. The air carried the faint trickle of the creek on the far side of the field, though he could not yet see it. That sound, constant and patient, reminded him of mornings from his boyhood. He had walked this very route with a small tin pail in hand, his father striding ahead, the two of them heading for the creek to fetch water before breakfast. The memory was as clear as if it had happened yesterday. The way the grass brushed his knees, the way the cool air made his fingers ache just enough to notice. It was strange, he thought, how certain paths held memory better than others. A single step here could call back whole seasons, of summers when the field buzzed with grasshoppers, or of winters when the same ground was hidden under snow. The mist, too, had its own memories, like a keeper of the field's quiet stories. By the time he'd reached the far fence line, the sun had lifted higher, and the mist began to thin in soft, drifting pieces. The creek came into view, a narrow ribbon of water slipping over smooth stones. He leaned on the fence rail and watched the current catch at fallen leaves, carrying them downstream with an unhurried purpose. He could remember his grandmother saying that the creek's voice never stopped speaking, even if you left it for years. It would tell you the same story you had always known, but each time it would sound different. That morning it spoke in a low, contented murmur, as though pleased to have been found again. Elias stayed there a long while, watching light shift across the water. The sound of the creek mixed with the rustle of the field behind him, where the dew was already beginning to lift into the air. Above, the swallows traced their morning paths, swooping low and then vanishing into the brighter sky. When he finally turned back toward the garden, the gate stood waiting for him in the distance, framed by the slow dissolve of mist. The sight was so familiar, so anchored in his life, that he felt an odd comfort, like seeing the face of an old friend across a crowd. Crossing the field again, he noticed how each step seemed to leave a darker mark in the grass, only for it to fade within moments. It was a reminder that the world was always ready to soften what passed through it, to take in and release without judgment. Back at the gate, he paused before stepping inside. His hand rested once more on the rail, the wood warmer now as the sun reached it. The latch closed with its soft click, and he felt the quiet satisfaction of returning to a place that waited without expectation. The garden was brighter now, touched with gold where the sun found the edges of leaves. Somewhere near the rosemary bush, the wren appeared again, hopping lightly from twig to twig. Elias smiled without meaning to, as if the bird had been there to greet him all along. He returned to the porch, his boots leaving faint, damp prints on the boards. Inside, the kettle was waiting to be filled, the promise of tea and the rest of the day ahead. But for now, he lingered at the doorway, letting his eyes rest once more on the gate and the field beyond it, still holding traces of the morning mist. The day had been warm, with that gentle heaviness of midsummer that made everything move a little slower. By late afternoon, the air began to shift, soft breezes sliding through the garden, brushing against the rosemary and lavender, carrying their fragrance like quiet offerings to anyone who passed. Elias sat on the old bench near the garden gate, a mug of cool tea in his hand. The bench was nothing special, a plank seat between two worn arms, but it had been there for years, its wood shaped by the sun, rain, and countless hours of sitting. From this spot, he could see both the garden behind him and the field beyond the gate, an in-between place where he liked to spend these late hours of the day. The sky above was still holding on to the blue of daylight, but already faint strokes of gold and rose were beginning to gather along the horizon. Shadows deepened under the bean trellis, and the first chirr of evening crickets rose from somewhere near the fence. He remembered evenings like this from when he was young, running in the tall grass with a jar in his hands, trying to catch the fireflies that would begin to appear once the light softened enough. His mother had always called them little lanterns for the night, and he had believed her, imagining that each one carried a secret path for someone to follow in the dark. Now, as the sun slipped lower, the air around the garden seemed to grow expectant. The leaves turned their faces slightly, as if they too were waiting for the first flicker of light to appear. Elias leaned back, letting the wood of the bench press comfortably against his shoulders, and allowed himself to simply be part of that waiting. The garden had a way of teaching him patience. It never rushed from one hour to the next. Even at the height of bloom or the fullness of harvest, there was always time to stand still, to notice the small shifts that would otherwise go unseen. The first firefly arrived just as the last edge of the sun touched the far ridge, A soft golden blink near the gate post, there and gone, like a polite knock at the door. Elias smiled, setting his mug down beside him. Another light appeared near the beans, then another just above the rosemary bush. Within minutes, the garden was dotted with their small, deliberate glows. Each one floated in the air for a breath, then disappeared into the thickening dusk, only to return somewhere else. It was a kind of slow magic, the kind that asked for nothing but quiet attention. Beyond the gate, in the field, more lights began to gather. The mist that had lingered in the mornings was gone, replaced now by the warm breath of summer night, and in that air the fireflies drifted as if carried by invisible currents. Elias rested his elbows on his knees, watching them move in patterns too subtle to follow. There was no rush in their flickering, no urgency in their paths. It was as though they knew the whole night was theirs, and they would use it as gently as possible. Somewhere behind him, a kettle began to hum on the stove inside the house. He didn't rise to get it, not yet. The garden was holding him in place, the way certain moments will. The world beyond this small space could wait. For now, there was only the evening, the scent of warm herbs, and the quiet pulse of light moving through the air. In the dim light, the gate's wood seemed almost to glow itself, its pale grain catching what remained of the day. Elias reached out and touched it, feeling the smoothness where countless hands had worn the surface down. He thought of all the evenings the gate had stood here, watching seasons turn, how many summer nights it had witnessed, how many fireflies had risen in its view. The thought brought him a kind of comfort that was hard to explain. It wasn't the comfort of answers or of plans, but the comfort of knowing that some things, like the gate, the field, the fireflies, simply continued. Whether or not he was there to see them, they would return, marking the evenings with their quiet light. As darkness deepened, the crickets grew louder, and a whip-poor-will called from the far hedgerow. Elias sat until the fireflies began to fade, their glow less frequent as the air cooled. He picked up his mug, now empty, and stood slowly, stretching his back. Before heading inside, he paused at the gate one last time. The field was barely visible now, just a dark shape against the darker sky, but here and there a last few lights still floated in the air, small reminders that night had its own kind of stars. He closed the latch gently as if not to disturb them, and walked back toward the house, carrying the stillness of the evening with him. In the kitchen, the kettle had gone quiet, the air warm and faintly scented with chamomile. He poured himself another cup, knowing he would drink it slowly as the firefly's light lingered in his mind. The days had begun to shorten, though summer still held on in small, stubborn ways. The tomatoes near the back fence were still ripening, their skins warming in the afternoon sun, and the marigolds by the gate bloomed with a brightness that seemed almost defiant. But Elias could feel autumn moving closer, not in the sudden rush of wind or the sharp drop of temperature, but in the way the light began to bend differently across the garden, softer and more angled, as if it were searching for new corners to touch. That morning, a thin veil of mist had clung to the field beyond the gate, resting low over the grass until the sun finally pulled it away. The air was different now, holding that faint scent of fallen leaves, even though most of the trees were still full and green. Elias noticed these changes the way one notices an old friend's small habits, quietly, without need for words. It was on a day like this, many years ago, that his father had walked with him through the gate for the last time. Elias could still see it clearly, as though memory had set the scene aside in a frame. His father's slow steps, the sound of his boots against the packed earth, and the way he'd paused at the threshold to rest his hand on the top rail. They had gone out into the field to check the last of the hay bales before the first frost. The air that day had been cool, but not yet cold, just enough to make the breath show faintly in the light. He remembered the warmth of his father's voice, telling stories about the seasons before Elias was born, years when the rains came too soon or not at all. His father had spoken of the garden gate, too, how it had been built by his grandfather, out of oak cut from the woods along the creek, each joint fitted by hand. "It's not just a way in and out," his father had said, looking at the gate with a kind of fond respect. "It's the start of a path, and paths have a way of leading you to places you didn't expect." Elias didn't know it then, but that autumn would be his father's last. The memory carried no bitterness for him now, only a kind of soft gratitude, the way one might feel toward a candle that had burned long and steady before going out. Over the years, the garden gate had become not only a threshold to the fields, but also a keeper of that day, holding it in the grain of its wood and the quiet space just beyond its frame. Sometimes, when the light fell just right in the evening, Elias would stand there and almost feel his father's presence beside him, not as a sharp pang of loss, but as a steady warmth, like sunlight on the shoulder, or the smell of wood smoke drifting in from somewhere unseen. That evening, the air had the same weight as it had all those years ago. Elias leaned against the gate, looking out toward the far line of trees. The field was touched with the faintest gold, and in the hush of the hour, he could hear the slow hum of bees still moving among the asters. The past seemed very near then, not in a way that pulled him away from the present, but in a way that folded both together. He thought of his father's hand on the gate, the creak of the hinge, the steady way he had walked into the fading light of that autumn day. And standing there now, Elias realized that the gate had never been just a marker of where the garden ended. It was a witness, one that stood between seasons, between years, and between the lives of those who had come and gone. A breeze lifted, stirring the marigolds, and Elias watched a few petals loosen and drift toward the earth. Beyond the gate, the grass moved in slow ripples, catching what was left of the sunlight. He stayed there for a while longer until the first coolness of night began to settle in, and the shadows reached farther into the field. When he finally turned back toward the house, the thought came to him, quiet and certain, that his father had walked this same path many times, carrying his own memories, shaped by his own gates and seasons. The idea was comforting, the knowledge that life was made not of endings, but of many small passages, each one opening onto another. Inside, the lamplight had already softened the corners of the room. Elias set water to boil for tea, the faint sound of it beginning to murmur on the stove. From the window above the sink, he could see the gate in the dimming light, holding its place as it always had, between the garden and the field, between what was and what would be. He stood there a long moment, just watching as the steam rose from the kettle and the evening settled fully around him. The evening had begun like so many others, slowly, quietly, as if it had been unfolding since morning without anyone noticing. Elias was sitting near the window, a cup of tea cooling on the table beside him, when he caught the sound of footsteps on the gravel path outside. They were not hurried nor heavy, just a steady rhythm, deliberate enough to be familiar. For a moment, he thought perhaps it was one of the neighbors coming by with a jar of honey or a basket of apples, as often happened in this time of year. But when the sound paused just outside the garden gate, something in him stilled. It had been years since anyone stopped there before calling out or coming up the walk. Elias rose from his chair, his knees answering with a quiet stiffness, and stepped to the door. Through the fading light, he saw a figure standing at the gate. The person's hand rested lightly on the top rail, the way his father used to, and in the gold of the last sunlight, Elias recognized the slope of the shoulders, the tilt of the head. It was Samuel. The last time they had spoken face to face was long before the winters began to weigh on Elias's joints, back when they were both younger men with more work than years behind them. Samuel had lived just over the ridge, tending a small orchard and keeping bees. Then, as happens in the quiet turning of life, things shifted. His wife fell ill, the orchard was sold, and Samuel moved to live with his daughter in the town 3 valleys over. Elias pushed open the gate, the hinge offering its familiar creak. "Evening, Sam," he said, his voice breaking just enough to betray the years. Samuel smiled in that same unhurried way Elias remembered. "Evening," he replied, stepping through as though no time had passed at all. They stood for a moment without speaking, letting the air fill the space between them. The garden held the scent of mint and late roses, and the crickets had begun their patient song along the hedge. "I was coming through on my way to see the old place," Samuel said finally, his voice low, "and I thought I'd stop in, see if the gate still held its ground." Elias chuckled. "It has, better than I have, I think." They walked together toward the bench beneath the walnut tree, the evening stretching itself around them. Samuel moved more slowly than Elias remembered, but with the same care in each step, as if he was listening for the sound the earth made underfoot. They spoke about small things at first, the weather, the bees, the steady decline of the county fair. But slowly, their words found older ground. They remembered the year the creek had flooded and how they'd built a makeshift bridge from split fence rails to get the sheep across. They remembered the summer when the air stayed hot even through the night, and the two of them had sat out here with their families, passing a jug of well water back and forth, watching the stars until morning. As Samuel talked, Elias found himself studying the lines in his friend's face, not with sadness, but with recognition. Life had etched its patterns there, the same way it had in the fields and in the wood grain of the garden gate. The light thinned to a softer gray, and the first fireflies appeared along the far hedge. Samuel fell quiet for a long while, his eyes on the field beyond the gate. "You know," he said at last, "I used to think I'd miss the orchard most. The smell of the blossoms in spring, the way the fruit felt in my hands when it was ready. But it's this quiet here I've missed more than anything." Elias nodded, his gaze following the line of the path. "It's the kind of quiet that doesn't make you feel alone, just settled." They let the silence sit between them then, not as an absence but as something shared. The breeze carried the faintest rustle of the gate's latch, as if reminding them of its presence. When it grew too dim to see the details of each other's faces, Samuel stood. "I should keep on before it gets too dark," he said, "but I'm glad I stopped by." Elias rose with him, and they walked back to the gate. Samuel rested his hand on it once more, his fingers tracing the worn wood. "Still feels the same," he murmured. "Some things should," Elias replied. They shook hands, the gesture slow and uncertain, and then Samuel stepped out onto the gravel path. Elias watched as his friend's figure grew smaller in the soft dusk until it disappeared beyond the curve of the road. The night air settled cool against Elias's skin. He closed the gate gently, the latch catching in its familiar way, and stood for a moment longer, listening to the quiet. In the distance he could hear the faint hum of the crickets, steady as breath. Inside, the house waited, lamp warm, kettle still on the stove. But for now, Elias stayed by the gate, the memory of an old friendship warming him more than the tea ever could. When Samuel's footsteps had faded into the hush of the gravel path, Elias lingered at the garden gate longer than he meant to. The last trace of daylight had slipped behind the low hills, and the sky above was turning the deep, steady blue that always seemed to arrive without ceremony. The kind of blue that was neither day nor night, but something in between, like a pause in the breath of the world. He rested his palm on the top rail of the gate, the wood warm still from the day's sun. The grain under his hand was familiar, worn smooth where decades of hands had found their place. He thought of all the people who had stood here over the years, some to visit, some to pass through, some to say goodbye, and how the gate had stayed, the one constant in a life that seemed to be made of nothing but changes. Elias turned back toward the house, but his steps slowed almost immediately. There was no rush now, no one waiting for him but the quiet. The air smelled faintly of earth and mint, with a thread of wood smoke drifting from somewhere farther down the valley. From the hedgerow came the unhurried rasp of a cricket's call, answered here and there by others scattered through the darkening grass. He lowered himself onto the bench beneath the walnut tree, the same bench where he and Samuel had sat not an hour ago. The cushion of twilight was settling over the garden, softening its edges. Flowers he couldn't name were closing their petals, and the vines along the fence leaned into the night with a kind of trust. For a while, Elias simply watched the slow exchange between light and dark, each giving way to the other without resistance. His mind drifted, not to anything urgent or pressing, but to fragments of memory stirred loose by Samuel's visit. He remembered the feel of a summer morning 30 years past, when he and Samuel had carried buckets of water from the creek to keep the young apple trees alive. How the sun had been bright even before breakfast, how the cold water had sloshed against his boots, how Samuel's laugh had carried across the orchard when a bucket tipped. He remembered, too, the winter evening when Samuel had arrived at his door with a loaf of bread still warm from his wife's oven. Snow had been falling in thick, quiet sheets, and they had stood just inside the doorway, talking until the bread cooled, steam no longer curling from its crust. The images came without effort, like leaves floating downstream, and Elias let them pass before him. Somewhere in the distance a night bird called, low and steady. The sound pulled his gaze toward the far hedge, where the first of the fireflies had begun their soft, patient blinking. Their light rose and fell in no particular pattern, like a conversation spoken in a language only the summer evenings understood. Elias thought of what Samuel had said, that it was the quiet he missed most. Elias understood. The quiet here was not an emptiness. It was a presence, a kind of companion that asked nothing but offered everything. It wrapped itself around a person, reminded them that they were part of something slower, older, and far more enduring than their own small concerns. The night deepened, but it did not rush. The moon had yet to climb over the ridge, leaving the garden in a silver dimness. Elias could feel the day loosening its grip. each moment easing into the next without any need to mark the time. He could have sat there for hours and never felt the minutes slip past. He leaned back on the bench, the wood cool against his shoulders, and closed his eyes. The scents, the sounds, the soft movement of the air, they all seemed to braid together into something whole. He imagined Samuel making his way along the road, the gravel crunching underfoot, perhaps pausing to look back once more before the turn took the gate from view. And though they had parted without any promise of when they might meet again, Elias felt no loss in it. The evening had given them both what they needed, the quiet certainty that the bond between them remained, shaped by time and weathered by years, but still sound. When Elias finally rose, the kettle inside the house had gone cold. He poured the tea anyway, letting its warmth be more imagined than real, and carried the cup back to the bench. From here, the garden gate stood as it always had, steady against the night, ready for whoever might find their way to it next. He sipped slowly, feeling the calm settle in him as deeply as the night had settled over the garden. In this stillness, nothing was missing. Everything that mattered was here. The moon had risen by the time Elias finished his tea. He hadn't noticed it at first, the way the pale light had seeped over the ridge and into the garden, turning every leaf into a small mirror of silver. The bench, the gravel path, the worn boards of the gate, all were softened under that quiet glow. The air was cool now, with a freshness that hinted of the creek in the hollow. Somewhere beyond the walnut tree, an owl called once, then again, as if to remind the night that it was his to watch over. Elias smiled faintly, thinking how some things never asked for permission to belong. They simply did. He stood and walked slowly toward the gate, each step deliberate, the crunch of gravel underfoot sounding louder in the stillness. The world beyond the fence was a dim shape, fields gone to shadow, the dark slope of the hill, the suggestion of the road winding down toward the valley. Elias rested his hand on the latch but did not open it. There was no need to step outside tonight. This moment, this view, was enough. He could almost hear the footsteps of those who had come before, voices that lingered in the air like the fading scent of lilacs in June. His father, who had once leaned here to wait for the postman. His mother calling him in from the fields as a boy. Neighbors arriving with baskets of apples or jars of honey. Friends who stayed only a few minutes but left behind hours of conversation that lived on in memory. The moonlight lay across the garden like a blanket. It made the shadows longer, gentler, less like absences and more like quiet places to rest. Elias thought of Samuel again, how his friend had smiled at the sound of the wind in the vines, how he had paused to touch the gate before leaving, as though it might remember him until he returned. Perhaps it would. He stayed there for a long time, watching the way the light shifted as the moon climbed higher. The crickets had settled into a steady rhythm now, joined by the soft rustle of leaves overhead. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once and then fell silent. The world beyond the gate was sleeping, and the garden too seemed to lean toward rest. Elias felt that same pull within himself. The day had given him what it could, and now the night was offering the rest of it, the part that asked nothing, promised nothing, and yet gave everything. When at last he turned back toward the house, the kitchen lamp still glowed in the window, casting a warm square of light onto the worn boards of the porch. He stepped inside, closing the door with the gentle care of someone who knows the value of quiet. On the table sat the old teapot, the cup now empty. He rinsed it in the sink, set it upside down to dry, and moved through the rooms with the easy steps of habit. The bed waited, the quilt folded back as it had been every night for years. Before lying down, Elias crossed to the window. From here, he could see the garden gate framed in silver and shadow. It stood just as it always had, steadfast, welcoming, ready, a keeper of arrivals and departures, a place to pause, a place to remember. He let the sight of it fill him, the moonlight, the quiet, the unbroken line between this night and all the others that had come before. And as he lay back against the pillow, the weight of the day slid from him as gently as a leaf settling onto still water. The last thing he saw before sleep took him was that gate, patient and steady under the watch of the moon. And in the deep, unhurried quiet of the countryside, the night kept its promise. And so, as the moonlight rests quietly upon the garden gate, and the night folds itself around us like a soft blanket, I hope this story has given you a place to breathe, a place to rest. May your thoughts grow lighter, your breathing slower, and your heart settle into the peace you deserve. Good night, dear friend. May sleep come to you gently, like the hush of evening over an old field. May it hold you safe until the first light of morning, when the world begins again in its quiet, patient way. If you felt a sense of calm in this story, I would love to hear from you in the comments, only if you wish to share. And tell me, what story would you like me to tell you next?
you.